You were not invited, my father smirked, waving his VIP pass at the White House security checkpoint like it was a gold medal. Go home before you embarrass the family. I did not argue. I handed the Secret Service hostess my phone. She scanned the QR code, froze, and immediately turned to the four-star admiral beside her. Sir, she is here. My name is Camille Washington. I am 32 years old, and my family thought I was a failed law school dropout. What they did not know was that the President of the United States was waiting for my security briefing. Before I share exactly how I destroyed their entire elite social standing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to prove your toxic family wrong. The suffocating July heat in Potomac was nothing compared to the suffocating expectations of the Washington family. I stood on the massive stone patio of my parents' sprawling estate, flipping ribs over the custom outdoor grill while the heavy smoke stung my eyes. My mother, Vivian, stood a safe distance away, wearing a pristine white linen dress and her signature pearl necklace. She looked at me with open disgust, her nose wrinkled, as if my very presence offended her carefully curated aesthetic. Step back from the smoke, Camille, she scolded. You already look unkempt enough. Jasmine and Brad will be here any minute, and I will not have my son-in-law seeing you look like the hired help. Go wash your face. In her eyes, I had been a massive failure since the day I walked away from Howard University Law School 7 years ago. They never cared to ask why I left, and I never bothered to tell them that the Department of Defense had been quietly recruiting me to build advanced cybersecurity algorithms. They just assumed I was lazy and aimless. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and kept my focus on the grill. The crunch of gravel interrupted my thoughts. A sleek, slate-gray Porsche Macan pulled up the winding cobblestone driveway. My mother beamed, her face instantly transforming into a mask of pure adoration. She practically floated toward the front gate to greet them. My older sister, Jasmine, stepped out of the passenger side looking flawless in a tailored designer sundress. She was the undeniable golden child, a successful media lawyer who had followed the family script perfectly and secured the right kind of husband. From the driver's seat emerged Bradley Sterling. Brad was a 38-year-old venture capital director, white and perpetually smug. In my father's eyes, Brad was the ultimate trophy son-in-law, a man who brought Wall Street connections and proximity to the kind of wealth my father desperately craved to elevate his own lobbying career. Brad wore a designer finance vest and a condescending smirk that he reserved exclusively for me. Vivian, looking gorgeous as always, Brad announced, loudly kissing my mother on the cheek. Brad, darling, she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Come to the patio. Marcus is bringing out the good scotch for you. As they walked around the side of the house, Brad saw me standing by the grill. His smirk widened into something mocking and cruel. He jingled the heavy Porsche keys in his hand, the metal clinking sharply against the humid air. Hey, Cam, he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. Without waiting, he tossed the heavy keys right at my chest. Be a doll and park the Macan in the shade by the garages. The leather gets absolutely blistering in this sun. I did not raise my hands. I did not flinch. I simply took a half step to the right. The keys hit the brick patio with a harsh clatter, sliding into the grass. Jasmine gasped dramatically, pressing her hand to her chest like I had just committed a violent and unforgivable crime. My mother shrieked. Brad stopped dead in his tracks, his usually smug smile vanishing instantly into a very hard and very angry line. Excuse me, Brad demanded, his voice dropping an octave as his face reddened. The valet is right out front, Brad, I said, my voice completely steady and totally devoid of any emotion whatsoever. If you cannot afford to pay the simple $5 tip, you should have just parked it in the shade yourself. Camille! My mother yelled, rushing forward to pick up the keys herself. What is wrong with you? Brad is a guest in this house. You will treat him with respect. He is family, Mom, I corrected smoothly, which means he knows perfectly well I am not the parking attendant. What is going on out here? My father, Marcus, marched onto the patio holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch. Brad immediately pointed a finger at me, complaining loudly that I had thrown his keys on the ground out of bitter hostility. My father glared at me, his eyes full of absolute disdain. "Pick up the keys and apologize to your brother-in-law right now. Brad is the only one bringing real, substantial money into this family. He does not need your dropout attitude ruining his weekend. Real substantial money." What none of them knew was that my dummy corporation had just quietly bailed out Brad's failing venture capital firm from a massive $40 million margin call. My company, Aegis Protocol, had just cleared $2 billion in federal contracts. I held his furious gaze without blinking. "I am not apologizing," I said softly. "And I am not moving the car." My father's face immediately flushed a very dangerous purple. "Get inside," he barked. "Get out of my sight before you ruin this day for the people in this family who actually matter." I calmly turned off the gas grill and slowly walked away in complete silence, knowing their entire world was about to burn. The tension from the patio followed us into the formal dining room 2 hours later. The long mahogany table was set with my mother's finest crystal and china. The caterers had laid out a lavish spread of prime rib and lobster, but the atmosphere in the room was as cold and sterile as a morgue. I sat at the far end of the table, the designated kids' seat that I had occupied since I was a teenager. My father sat at the head holding court, his mood completely restored now that he had an audience to boast to. He was slicing into his prime rib with aggressive precision, bragging about his latest lobbying efforts with Senator Hastings. He claimed he had locked down regulatory exemptions for a telecommunications merger and that the senator owed him a massive favor. Jasmine beamed, swirling her wine glass and praising his firm. My father exchanged a knowing, arrogant glance with Brad, claiming they compensated him appropriately, which brought him to the real news of the evening. My father reached into the inner pocket of his tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed gold seal of the President of the United States. He placed it in the center of the table like a holy relic. My mother gasped, pressing her hands to her cheeks. My father announced it was for the White House Gala for National Security and Defense. He called it the most exclusive event of the political season, an invite-only reception in the East Room, followed by a classified awards ceremony with the President and the Joint Chiefs. Brad let out a low whistle, clearly impressed, asking how a lobbyist scored invites to a military intelligence gala. My father smirked, tapping the envelope, explaining he called in his favor with Hastings on the Armed Services Committee to secure 3 VIP passes for the outer reception. He declared he was taking Jasmine and Brad. He claimed Brad's venture firm was looking to pivot into government tech contracts, and Jasmine's media law background made her the perfect conversationalist for politicians. It was a strategic networking opportunity, and he needed his absolute best assets in that room. My mother looked disappointed for a fraction of a second before nodding dutifully, agreeing it was an investment in the family's future. I sat quietly chewing my food. I knew exactly what this gala was. My company, Aegis Protocol, was the primary sponsor of the event. The award ceremony was not just a generic military event. It was a highly classified induction honoring the architects of the newly deployed defensive cyber shield that had successfully thwarted a massive state-sponsored hack on the United States power grid last month. I was the lead architect. My father looked down the table at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. He told me not to look so glum, adding that it was not like I would have anything appropriate to wear to the East Room anyway. He said I would not know what the inside of the White House looks like unless I bought a ticket for the public tourist tour. Jasmine let out a sharp melodic laugh, telling him not to be mean and joking, that maybe I could fix the Wi-Fi in the West Wing while they were having champagne. Brad chuckled, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, adopting a patronizing tone. He told me he and Jasmine knew I had been struggling since I left school, bouncing around and doing whatever it is I do on my laptop in my little apartment. I told him I was an independent contractor, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Brad made air quotes with his fingers and smirked. He said he had talked to the human resources director at his venture capital firm. They had an opening for an entry-level IT help desk position. He said I would be resetting passwords and fixing printer jams, but it came with benefits and paid $40,000 a year. The table went dead silent. My mother looked at Brad like he was a saint offering salvation to a wretched sinner. She placed a hand over her heart and praised his incredible generosity, telling me that my brother-in-law was putting his own professional reputation on the line to vouch for me. Brad shrugged modestly, bathing in my mother's praise. He called it an honest living and told me it was time I stopped tinkering with computers, pretending I was an entrepreneur, and got a real job. He added that 40 grand was a lot of money for a dropout. I looked at Brad and his smug, self-satisfied grin. He truly believed he was being a magnanimous savior, tossing a few pennies at his pathetic sister-in-law. He had absolutely no idea that my personal net worth had crossed the billion-dollar mark 2 quarters ago. I carefully set my fork down, picked up my napkin, and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I told him I appreciated the thought, but I was going to pass. The air in the room instantly crystallized. Jasmine raised her voice in shrill disbelief, asking if I was insane and accusing me of spitting on a career handed to me on a silver platter. I told her I did not need a career at a help desk and that I was doing just fine. My father slammed his fist down on the table so hard the crystal wine glasses violently clattered against each other. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He bellowed that I was an ungrateful, arrogant little wretch. He accused me of sitting at his table, eating his food, and spitting in the face of the only man willing to pull me out of the gutter. My mother pleaded with him to watch his blood pressure, though she was glaring daggers at me. My father pointed a shaking finger at me. He screamed that I was 32 years old and had nothing. He called me a lazy dropout, an ugly, stubborn failure, and an absolute embarrassment to the Washington name. I did not blink or cry. The days of his words having the power to hurt me had died a long time ago. Suddenly, my highly secured phone vibrated in my pocket with a harsh, rhythmic buzz. It was an encrypted, localized alert. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Admiral James Sterling. "The Pentagon awaits your authorization codes for the Gala Director, Washington. We are ready for you, ma'am." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back from the table. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through his rage like a scalpel. "I have no place at this table." He demanded to know where I was going, shouting that he was not finished talking to me. I told him I was finished, turned my back, and told Brad good luck with his government pivot because the contracting process can be unforgiving. I walked out of the house in complete silence, leaving them to their delusions of grandeur. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, crisp clarity. I bypassed the standard traffic of the capital and pulled my armored SUV into the subterranean garage of Aegis Protocol headquarters. The facility was an unmarked, brutalist concrete fortress nestled just outside Alexandria. To the public, it was an unnamed data center. To the Department of Defense, it was the absolute apex of private military intelligence. I walked through the biometric security gates. Retinal scanners chimed in rapid succession, unlocking reinforced steel doors as I approached. Armed guards in tactical gear stepped back, giving me crisp nods of respect. I stepped into the main operations floor, a massive, dimly lit cavern filled with glowing server banks and massive holographic global threat monitors. My chief operating officer, Xavier, was already waiting for me at the entrance to my glass-walled office. Xavier was a former NSA director of operations who did not easily show emotion, but this morning his jaw was set tight. "Good morning, Director," he said, falling into step beside me. "We have a severe compliance issue that requires your immediate attention. It concerns Apex Solutions." Apex Solutions was the dummy corporation I had set up years ago to handle mid-tier defense contracts without drawing attention to my name or my primary empire. I placed my briefcase on my desk and poured a cup of black coffee. "What is the issue with Apex?" I asked. Xavier handed me a thick red classified folder. "We intercepted illegal financial wire transfers and encrypted communications early yesterday morning. Someone is actively lobbying Senator Hastings to completely block Apex Solutions from the upcoming Department of Defense logistics contract. The lobbyist is offering massive bribes and illegal campaign contributions to steer the $70 million contract away from us and hand it directly to Sterling Venture Capital. I stopped with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. Sterling Venture Capital, Brad's firm. I opened the red folder and scanned the intercepted communications. There were bank routing numbers, offshore accounts, and transcripts of recorded phone calls. I recognized the phone number making the bribes immediately. It was my father. Marcus Washington was willing to commit federal crimes to block a company he did not know belonged to his own daughter, all to elevate his white son-in-law. He was actively sabotaging my hidden asset to secure a win for a man who offered me a $40,000 help desk job. Xavier watched my face carefully. The lobbyist is Marcus Washington, ma'am. Given your relation, I wanted to bring this to you directly. He is engaging in blatant federal bribery. We can have the Department of Justice arrest him before lunch. We can also permanently block Sterling Venture Capital from even entering the preliminary bidding phase. Just give the word. I stared at the financial transcripts. My father was risking prison just to make Brad look like a winner. He was so desperate to secure his proximity to Brad's perceived wealth that he was breaking federal law. He had no idea he was playing a game of chess against a grandmaster while he was blindfolded. I slowly closed the red folder and handed it back to Xavier. "Do not block the lobbying," I said softly. Xavier blinked, his stoic expression breaking for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am, if we let this proceed, Marcus Washington will successfully steer the preliminary bid to Sterling Venture Capital. Apex Solutions will lose the initial award." I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. "Let Brad win the preliminary bid," I ordered. "Sign the directive authorizing Sterling Venture Capital as the initial contractor." Xavier frowned, clearly confused by my willingness to let my own company lose a contract to a criminal scheme. "But ma'am, why?" "Because Xavier, the Department of Defense logistics contract is not just a standard funding award. It is a classified data handling operation. Read the fine print in Section 4 of the compliance mandate." Xavier opened the folder again and flipped to the contract stipulations. His eyes rapidly scanned the text. He stopped reading and looked up at me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he finally understood the trap. "Any firm awarded the preliminary bid must undergo a sudden, unannounced Tier 1 military security audit within 48 hours of acceptance," Xavier read aloud. "If the firm fails the audit, they are held financially liable for the entire value of the contract due to breach of federal security protocols." "Exactly," I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the server floor. "Brad's firm is a disaster. His cybersecurity infrastructure is basically held together by duct tape and arrogance. He is heavily leveraged and failing. When he accepts that $70 million contract, he assumes total financial liability for his own security flaws. He will fail the military audit spectacularly. When he does, the federal government will liquidate his entire venture capital firm to recoup the damages." And Marcus Washington, Xavier added, finishing the thought. "His illegal bribes are tied directly to Brad's application. When the firm collapses under federal audit, the Department of Justice will trace the lobbying money right back to your father's offshore accounts." I turned back to Xavier, my face perfectly calm. "My father wants Brad to be the provider. I am going to let him provide his own destruction. Authorize the preliminary win for Sterling Venture Capital. Let them celebrate. I want them feeling absolutely untouchable right before the gala." Xavier nodded sharply, closing the folder. "Understood, Director. It will be executed immediately." As Xavier walked out of my office to initiate the corporate execution of my family's financial future, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I had a White House security briefing to prepare for, and a custom haute couture gown to pick up. My father thought I was an embarrassment who did not belong in his world. He was about to find out that his world only existed because I allowed it to. The discreet gold lettering on the glass doors of Maison de Laurent in Georgetown signaled a level of exclusivity that money alone could not buy. This was an appointment-only establishment where politicians' wives and international diplomats secured their gala wear. You did not just walk in, you had to be invited. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, instantly enveloped by the scent of white lilies and expensive leather. My afternoon was operating on a razor-thin schedule. The White House briefing was in 3 hours, and I needed to retrieve my custom gown. I walked across the plush cream carpet, entirely focused on my itinerary, until a sharp, familiar laugh cut through the quiet elegance of the boutique. I stopped. Standing in front of a massive gilded mirror in the center of the showroom was Jasmine. She was admiring herself in a beaded emerald evening gown, turning side to side while a flustered sales associate pinned the hem. Sitting on a velvet sofa nearby, holding a crystal flute of complimentary champagne, was my mother. Vivian looked completely in her element, basking in the glow of high-end retail and the imagined superiority it gave her. I should have walked past them, but the layout of the showroom made that impossible. The moment I took another step, Vivian caught my reflection in the mirror. Her champagne glass halted mid-air. The look of serene luxury on her face immediately warped into a harsh, pinching scowl. She set her glass down on a side table with a sharp clink and stood up, marching directly toward me before I could even reach the reception desk. "Camille," Vivian hissed, keeping her voice low but entirely lethal. "What in the world are you doing here?" Jasmine turned around, her eyes widening in disbelief. She let out a short, condescending sigh. "Are you seriously stalking us now, Cam? This is getting sad." "I am picking up an order," I said evenly, keeping my posture relaxed and my hands resting in my coat pockets. "Picking up an order," my mother repeated, her tone dripping with absolute mockery. "Camille, this is Maison de Laurent. They do not sell business casual separates for your little freelance projects. They certainly do not offer payment plans or layaway. If you wandered in here to gawk at things you cannot afford, you need to turn around and walk right back out." "I am not here to window shop, Mom," I replied, my voice completely devoid of the intimidation she was desperately trying to provoke. "I have an appointment." Vivian stepped closer, her eyes flashing with venomous pride. "Do not lie to me. I know exactly what your finances look like. Brad offered you a $40,000 lifeline just yesterday and you threw it in his face. Now you are trying to loiter in the most exclusive boutique in Washington just to pretend you have any status at all. You are embarrassing yourself. Worse, you are embarrassing me. The senator's wife shops here. If anyone associates my family name with a woman begging for discount rack favors, I will never forgive you." Jasmine stepped off the pedestal, carefully holding the emerald fabric of her dress. "Mom is right, Camille. Brad gave me his black card this morning specifically so I could find the perfect gown for the White House tonight. We are spending real money here. You being here looking like you just rolled out of bed is insulting to the staff. Just go home." I looked at Jasmine and then at my mother. They were so fiercely desperate to protect their fragile illusion of wealth that they were actively trying to chase their own blood out of a clothing store. Before I could respond, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the showroom swung open. The boutique director, a notoriously strict French woman named Genevieve, who catered exclusively to billionaires, and royalty, stepped out holding a garment bag made of opaque black silk. Vivian immediately plastered on her most radiant, sycophantic smile and turned toward the director. "Genevieve, darling," my mother cooed, adjusting her pearls. "I am so sorry about this interruption. My daughter got a little lost looking for the exit. We will have her out of your hair in just a second. I am ready to pay for Jasmine's dress now." Genevieve did not even look at my mother. She walked right past Vivian, entirely ignoring her outstretched hand. The director stopped directly in front of me, her severe expression melting into a look of absolute reverence. "Dr. Washington," Genevieve said, bowing her head slightly. "It is an immense honor to have you in my boutique today. Your security detail informed us you were running a tight schedule, so I prepared the garment myself." My mother froze, her mouth hung open. Jasmine dropped the hem of her emerald dress, staring at Genevieve as if the woman had just spoken in tongues. "Thank you, Genevieve," I said with a polite nod. "Is the tailoring complete?" "Flawless as requested," Genevieve answered, her voice brimming with pride. She carefully unzipped the black silk bag to reveal the gown. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet hand, stitched with crushed sapphire crystals that caught the light like a galaxy. It was custom couture flown in directly from the Paris runway. It is the only one of its kind in North America, Dr. Washington. At $25,000, it is truly a museum piece. Shall I have my staff carry it to your armored vehicle outside? That would be wonderful, I replied. Vivian stood absolutely paralyzed. Her eyes darted from the breathtaking $25,000 gown to the boutique director and finally to me. The color had completely drained from her face. Jasmine was practically hyperventilating, staring at my dress with a mixture of raw envy and total incomprehension. Dr. Washington. My mother stammered the words stumbling out of her mouth. Genevieve, there must be a mistake. She is unemployed. Genevieve finally turned to look at my mother, her gaze icy and full of aristocratic disdain. Madam, Dr. Washington is our most valued black-tier client. I would ask that you lower your voice in her presence. I gave my mother a small, razor-sharp smile. Enjoy your shopping, Mom. See you at the gates. I turned and walked toward the exit, the boutique staff rushing to open the doors for me. But before I even reached the sidewalk, the final note of my orchestrated trap snapped shut. Behind me at the register, Vivian slammed Brad's heavy metal credit card down on the marble counter to pay for Jasmine's dress, desperate to reclaim some shred of her shattered dignity. The cashier swiped the card. A harsh electronic beep echoed through the quiet store. I am sorry, ma'am. The cashier said, her voice echoing clearly across the showroom. The card was declined. Declined! Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. That is impossible. That is a corporate limitless account. Swipe it again. The cashier swiped it a second time. Another loud beep rang out. I am afraid the system is reading a total corporate account. Freeze, the cashier announced, looking at Vivian with polite pity. The bank says the issuing venture capital firm is under federal audit. The funds do not exist. I stepped out into the blinding July sun, leaving my mother and sister standing in the middle of the luxury boutique, humiliated, penniless, and entirely out of options. I sat behind the massive slab of obsidian glass that served as my desk at Aegis Protocol headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office offered an unobstructed, commanding view of the United States Capitol building. The afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the white marble dome, a fitting backdrop for the power plays unfolding across the city. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the absolute silence of my secure suite. My personal cell phone buzzed against the glass desk. The caller ID displayed Bradley Sterling. I let it ring 3 times before calmly swiping the screen to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply waited. Camille, what is your problem? Brad barked immediately. His voice was loud, frantic, and dripping with the kind of entitled rage I had come to expect from him. I just got a hysterical phone call from Jasmine. She is crying in the back of an Uber because of you. I took another sip of my coffee. I assumed she would be busy getting fitted for her dress, I said smoothly. Brad let out a harsh, patronizing breath. Do not play dumb with me. You followed them to Maison de Laurent just to cause a scene. You brought your toxic broke energy into a high-end store and stressed Jasmine out so badly that the fraud alert triggered on my corporate card. The bank locked my account because of the suspicious activity you caused by loitering around them. You humiliated your mother and your sister. He actually believed a fraud alert had caused the decline. His ego was so massive, so impenetrable, that the idea of his venture capital firm actually failing was completely incomprehensible to him. He needed a scapegoat, and as usual, the family dropout was the easiest target. I am very busy, Brad, I said, my tone completely flat. If you called just to complain about a declined credit card, you should probably contact your accounting department instead of me. I called to give you a reality check, Brad snapped. His voice dripped with white savior arrogance. I tried to help you yesterday. I offered you a real job. I offered to pull you out of whatever pathetic, aimless rut you have been stuck in for the last 7 years, and you threw it in my face. Well, congratulations, Camille. You just burned your only bridge. He paused, clearly waiting for me to apologize or beg. When I offered nothing but silence, his tone turned venomous and deeply boastful. You want to act like you are above a $40,000 job? He sneered. Let me tell you what real success looks like. My firm just received the preliminary award for a $70 million Department of Defense logistics contract. We are moving into the federal sector. I am sitting at the big table now. I have senators on speed dial and generals inviting me to the White House tonight. I have real power in this district. He was practically panting with self-satisfaction. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the traffic flow around the Capitol building. It was almost poetic how eagerly he was tightening the noose around his own neck. Because you decided to be a bitter, ungrateful brat, Brad continued, his voice dropping into a sinister threat. I am going to make sure you never work in this city. I know every major tech recruiter in the Beltway. I know the HR directors. I am making a few phone calls this afternoon. By the time I am done, you will be permanently blacklisted. You will not be able to get a job fixing laptops at a local middle school, let alone a tech company in Washington. You are done. I placed my coffee cup down on the glass desk. The ceramic made a sharp, decisive clink. Are you finished, Brad? I asked, my voice remaining quiet, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Brad scoffed. I am finished with you. Enjoy your miserable life, Camille. Before you hang up, Brad, I highly suggest you take a moment to look over the paperwork for your shiny new defense contract, I said. My words were precise and measured. Specifically, I suggest you read the fine print under Section 4 of the Federal Compliance Mandate. What are you talking about? Brad demanded, his arrogant tone slipping into momentary confusion. You do not know the first thing about federal contracts. Stop pretending you understand my business. I understand that a preliminary bid is not a final award, Brad, I replied smoothly. I also understand that accepting that preliminary bid makes you instantly and entirely financially liable for your firm's current cybersecurity infrastructure. Have a wonderful time at the gala tonight. I will see you there. I ended the call. I did not wait to hear his reaction. I set the phone face down on my desk and turned my attention to the large holographic monitor mounted on my office wall. I tapped a sequence of keys on my encrypted keyboard, entering my executive authorization code. Miles away, sitting in his lavish downtown office, Brad stared at his phone in confusion. He scoffed, tossing the device onto his desk, convinced I was just spouting desperate, jealous nonsense. He turned back to his dual monitors to review his upcoming meetings. The exact second his eyes met the screens, the fluorescent lights in his office flickered. The soft hum of his firm's massive server room down the hall completely died. Brad frowned, jiggling his computer mouse. The cursor did not move. His primary monitor went entirely black. Then his secondary monitor followed. The digital phones on every desk in his firm simultaneously went dead. A blinding blood-red warning banner suddenly slashed across both of his dark screens. The bold white text locked his system entirely. Security audit pending. Federal compliance breach detected. All assets frozen. Aegis Protocol command. Brad felt the blood drain from his face. His heart slammed against his ribs as he stared at the words Aegis Protocol, the very company the Pentagon general was supposed to introduce him to tonight, the company that currently held the keys to his entire financial existence. He slammed his fists on the keyboard, frantically pressing buttons, but the red warning simply glowed brighter, an inescapable digital death sentence. He was completely locked out of his own empire. The evening air in Washington, D.C. hung thick with July humidity and the electric hum of political power. At the outer security perimeter of the White House, located near 15th Street and E Street Northwest, the chaos of the city collided with the absolute rigidity of the United States Secret Service. A long line of black town cars and rented limousines idled bumper to bumper, discharging hundreds of ambitious social climbers, mid-level politicians, and eager lobbyists into the sweltering heat. My family arrived in a rented stretch limousine that Marcus had undoubtedly overpaid for. From my vantage point, several blocks away, monitoring the checkpoint feeds via my secure tablet, I could see the exact moment they stepped onto the asphalt. Marcus emerged first, adjusting the lapels of his tuxedo with a self-important tug. He looked around at the crowded security line with immediate disdain, clearly annoyed that his perceived status had not earned him an empty red-carpeted walkway. Vivian followed, fanning herself aggressively, while fussing over the backup dress Jasmine had been forced to wear after the catastrophic decline of Brad's credit card earlier that afternoon. Jasmine looked sour, pulling at the fabric of a gown that was entirely inadequate for the caliber of the room they were trying to enter. Brad stepped out last. He was unusually quiet, his face pale and shining with cold sweat. He kept pulling his phone out of his pocket, staring at the blank, dead screen. He was a man standing on the absolute edge of financial ruin, desperately hoping that rubbing shoulders with a few Pentagon officials tonight would magically reverse the apocalyptic freeze I had placed on his entire firm. Marcus marched straight past the line of waiting guests, leading his family directly to the front of the security barricade. He pulled the cream-colored envelopes from his breast pocket and waved the Tier 3 VIP passes in the face of a stone-faced Secret Service agent. "I am Marcus Washington," my father announced, his voice booming loudly enough to ensure the surrounding crowd heard him. "Senator Hastings personally arranged these passes for my family. We are VIP guests for the East Room reception. I need you to open this barricade and expedite our screening. We have highly sensitive networking to attend to." The Secret Service agent did not blink. He glanced at the passes, then pointed a gloved finger toward the back of the winding line. "Those are general reception passes, sir. You need to join the queue at the rear. Have your government-issued identification ready for screening." Marcus scoffed, his face flushing with indignation. He stepped closer to the agent, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate a man who was literally trained to take a bullet for the president. "You do not understand who you are speaking to. I am a highly connected lobbyist in this district. I do not stand in lines. Get your supervisor out here right now." "Sir, step back from the barricade," the agent commanded, his voice dropping into a flat, dangerous register. "Join the line or your invitations will be revoked." Vivian grabbed Marcus by the arm, whispering frantically, her eyes darting around to see who was witnessing their public humiliation. Brad looked like he was going to be sick right there on the pavement. Marcus gritted his teeth, visibly vibrating with rage, but he reluctantly stepped back, humiliated by the realization that in the true hierarchy of Washington power he was completely irrelevant. It was precisely at this moment that the heavy, synchronized roar of specialized engines echoed down the street. The crowded security line fell silent. Even the Secret Service agents straightened their postures, shifting their attention away from Marcus. A motorcade of 4 matte black, heavily armored Chevrolet Suburbans glided into view. They bypassed the stagnant traffic, entirely utilizing a restricted priority lane that had been completely closed off to the public. The flashing blue and red grille lights reflected off the surrounding concrete barricades, casting an authoritative glow over the stunned crowd. The vehicles bore the unmistakable exempt government license plates reserved for the absolute highest echelon of federal intelligence and defense directors. The motorcade came to a smooth, synchronized halt, directly adjacent to the general VIP line, where my family was currently sweating in the humidity. Heavily armed tactical agents stepped out of the lead and trailing vehicles in perfect unison. They immediately formed a secure physical perimeter around the second SUV, their eyes scanning the crowd with lethal precision. The entire street watched in breathless silence. Marcus stood frozen, his Tier 3 passes clutched uselessly in his fist, staring at the armored convoy with wide, covetous eyes. He was undoubtedly wondering which powerful senator or cabinet member was about to step out, calculating how he might break protocol, just to hand them a business card. An agent stepped forward and pulled open the heavy ballistic door of the second Suburban. I stepped out into the blinding wash of the security floodlights. The midnight blue velvet of the custom Maison de Laurent gown absorbed the harsh light, while the thousands of hand-stitched sapphire crystals caught the flashes of distant press cameras, glittering like a constellation brought down to earth. I did not look at the crowd. I did not look at the line. I moved with the effortless, practiced grace of a woman who commanded the very ground she walked on. Flanked by 4 federal agents, I began my approach toward the priority security gate. From the corner of my eye, I saw the exact moment the realization hit them. Vivian gasped so sharply she actually choked, her hands flying up to clutch her pearls. Jasmine's jaw dropped open, her eyes bugging out of her head as she recognized the $25,000 couture masterpiece she had been denied just hours earlier. Brad took a physical step backward, his mind violently connecting the dots between the catastrophic collapse of his venture capital firm and the woman currently stepping out of a federal intelligence convoy. But Marcus could not comprehend it. His massive, fragile ego simply refused to allow the reality of the situation to process. His brain short-circuited. He convinced himself that this was a mistake, an elaborate prank, or that I had somehow managed to sneak into a government vehicle just to embarrass him in front of the political elite. He saw his disgraced dropout daughter walking past him toward the gates of power, and his mind completely snapped. Marcus dropped his VIP passes onto the asphalt. He broke the security line, shoving past a velvet rope and charging directly toward the restricted priority zone. He rushed the barricade, lunging forward with a furious, unhinged snarl, desperately reaching out to grab my arm. "What are you doing here? You aren't invited. Security, remove her." Before his fingers could even brush the midnight blue velvet of my gown, a solid wall of black Kevlar materialized between us. The lead agent of my federal security detail did not shout or issue a verbal warning. He simply stepped directly into my father's path and executed a flawless tactical block, driving a rigid, heavily muscled forearm straight against Marcus's chest. The impact stopped my father dead in his tracks, sending him stumbling backward onto the sweltering asphalt. "How dare you put your hands on me?" Marcus sputtered, his face contorting into a violent mask of shock and wounded pride. He frantically smoothed the lapels of his rented tuxedo, desperately trying to recover a sense of dignity that had already evaporated into the humid air. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger at me, completely ignoring the heavily armed federal agent who was now staring at him with lethal intent. "I am talking to my daughter. Do you hear me, Camille? What kind of insane stunt are you pulling here? You have absolutely no business being anywhere near these gates." Marcus reached into his breast pocket and yanked out the cream-colored envelope he had been flaunting all afternoon. He held his Tier 3 VIP pass high above his head, wielding the thick cardstock like a golden ticket to the inner circle of the universe. "I am a registered official guest of Senator Hastings," he barked, his voice echoing sharply across the hushed crowd of onlookers. "I have highly vetted clearance. You are a law school dropout who cannot even hold down a respectable job. You are not invited to this event. You are trespassing on federal property." The silence surrounding the priority lane deepened into something heavy and suffocating. High-level diplomats, wealthy politicians, and elite socialites turned their heads, their eyes wide, as they watched a supposedly prominent Washington lobbyist lose his mind on a public sidewalk. Near the general admission line, my mother Vivian was practically hyperventilating. She pulled violently at the sleeve of Brad's jacket, begging him to intervene and stop the spectacle. But Brad simply stared at the ground, too paralyzed by the terrifying realization of his own impending bankruptcy to move a single muscle. Jasmine buried her face in her hands, desperately wishing the concrete would crack open and swallow her whole. "Go home," Marcus snarled, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own desperate social climbing. "Go home right now before you get yourself arrested and humiliate this family even more than you already have in your miserable life. I will not let your pathetic, childish need for attention ruin the absolute most important networking night of my entire career. Turn around and get out of my sight." I did not flinch. I did not frown. I did not offer him a single syllable of validation. For 32 years, I had allowed Marcus Washington's booming voice to dictate my worth. I had internalized his endless critiques, his toxic conditional love, and his suffocating vanity. But tonight, standing in the shadow of the White House, his shouting sounded remarkably like the desperate, irrelevant noise of a man who was already a ghost. I looked right through him as if he were made of glass. I simply turned my head, breaking eye contact with the cold precision of a guillotine, and continued walking toward the heavily fortified entry checkpoint. My father's shouts grew increasingly frantic behind me, but his voice was swallowed by the ambient hum of the city and the heavy, synchronized thud of my security detail's boots matching my stride. We approached the primary access podium, A lead Secret Service hostess stood behind the thick bulletproof glass flanked by several armed guards in a complex digital scanning station. She was a stern, highly trained operative whose sole purpose was to keep unauthorized threats out of the most powerful building on Earth. She watched my approach with a clinical, unblinking focus. "Good evening, ma'am," the hostess said, her tone perfectly polite, but laced with absolute unyielding authority. "I need to see your official hard copy invitation and a valid government-issued identification. There are no exceptions at this checkpoint." I did not speak a word. I reached into my clutch and retrieved my highly encrypted mobile device. I bypassed the standard screen and opened a localized classified application that did not exist on any public commercial server. A shifting, multifaceted QR code bloomed across the bright screen, glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light. I held the device out over the marble counter, presenting the screen directly to the digital reader mounted on her podium. The hostess leaned forward with the handheld scanner. A red laser passed over the screen of my phone. The machine did not emit the standard dull beep of a regular VIP guest checking into a reception. Instead, the scanner triggered a sharp, ascending multi-tone chime that pierced the humid night air. It was a specific auditory override, an absolute top-tier clearance signal recognized only by the highest levels of national defense. The instant that unique chime echoed across the checkpoint, the atmosphere physically shifted. Every single armed Secret Service agent within earshot instantly stiffened. Their hands dropped sharply to their sides, adopting a braced, rigid posture of total militant submission. The casual vigilance of the security checkpoint vanished, entirely replaced by an overwhelming atmosphere of absolute reverence. The hostess looked down at the secured monitor built directly into her podium. Whatever highly classified credentials flashed across that screen drained the blood entirely from her face. Her rigid professional composure fractured into pure, unadulterated awe. Her eyes widened so far, they seemed entirely white in the harsh glare of the security floodlights. Her hands trembled slightly as she slowly pulled the scanner back. She did not ask for my identification. She did not ask for a printed envelope or a passport. The hostess snapped her head to the right, looking past the line of standing agents toward the massive, imposing figure of the four-star admiral standing near the inner gate. She swallowed hard, her voice dropping into a breathless, urgent whisper that carried clearly through the sudden, absolute silence of the checkpoint. "Sir, she is here." Admiral James Sterling stepped out from the shadows of the fortified archway. He was a man carved from pure authority. The 4 silver stars on his pristine uniform gleamed under the harsh security lights, and his chest was decorated with rows of colorful commendations that spoke of decades of strategic warfare. He moved with a heavy, measured stride, bypassing the frantic, desperate energy of the checkpoint entirely. Behind the velvet ropes of the general admission line, my father leaned forward on the tips of his expensive leather shoes. Marcus Washington was practically vibrating with anticipation. His lips were parted in a greedy, expectant sneer. In his mind, the script was already written and ready to be executed. He was waiting for the admiral to bark an angry order. He was waiting for the federal agents to draw their weapons, tackle his arrogant dropout daughter to the asphalt, and drag her away in cold steel handcuffs. He was waiting for the ultimate public validation of his lifelong belief that I was nothing but an embarrassment who had finally flown too close to the sun. The admiral closed the distance between us. He stopped exactly 3 paces away. The entire security perimeter seemed to hold its collective breath. Marcus opened his mouth, likely preparing a loud performative apology to the surrounding diplomats for his estranged daughter's criminal trespassing. The admiral did not reach for handcuffs. He did not issue a sharp command to his heavily armed security detail. Instead, the highest-ranking cyber warfare officer in the United States military squared his broad shoulders, brought his right hand up in a sharp razor-precise arc, and executed a flawless military salute. The crisp snap of his leather glove against his brow seemed to echo like a gunshot across the crowded pavement. "Dr. Washington," Admiral Sterling said. His voice was deep, resonant, and overflowing with absolute, unfiltered respect. "It is a profound honor to finally welcome you in person. The President and the Joint Chiefs are waiting for your security briefing in the Oval Office before the main ceremony begins. If you will follow me, we have cleared the West Wing corridors for your arrival." On the other side of the barricade, the Washington family ceased to function entirely. The psychological devastation was instant, absolute, and utterly catastrophic. The fragile reality they had meticulously constructed over the last 7 years shattered into microscopic fragments right there on the sidewalk. My mother Vivian physically swayed on her designer heels. Her knees buckled slightly as her expensive clutch slipped from her manicured fingers and hit the ground. Her mouth moved opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. She stared at the 4-star admiral saluting the daughter she had just mocked in a dress shop, her brain utterly incapable of bridging the massive gap between her toxic delusion and the terrifying truth unfolding in front of her. Jasmine gripped the metal security barricade just to keep herself upright. The golden child, the successful media lawyer who had spent her entire adult life treating me like a pathetic charity case, looked like she had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. She looked down at her own rented secondary gown, then back up at the federal convoy, the Secret Service detail, and the undeniable, terrifying power radiating from the sister she had relentlessly bullied. Her entire identity, built on being the superior Washington daughter, dissolved into thin air. But it was Brad who truly understood the lethal gravity of the situation. Brad, the arrogant venture capitalist who had patronizingly offered me a $40,000 help desk job just hours ago to save me from my own pathetic existence. He stood completely paralyzed, his pastel shirt rapidly soaking with cold, nervous sweat. He stared at me, his mind racing backward. He thought about the declined credit card. He thought about the sudden devastating freeze on his corporate accounts. He thought about the red warning screen bearing the name Aegis Protocol. He looked at me standing confidently among the military elite, and the final fatal puzzle piece clicked into place. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. He had not just insulted his sister-in-law at a family cookout. He had actively mocked the billionaire architect of the nation's cyber defense grid, the very woman who now completely owned his financial existence. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows watching the executioner casually reach for the lever. "It is an honor to be here, Admiral," I replied smoothly, returning his professional nod without a single ounce of hesitation. "Please lead the way." The Secret Service agents instantly shifted their rigid formation. They did not just open the gate. They formed a highly coordinated, protective human corridor, parting the sea of politicians, diplomats, and wealthy socialites like royalty passing through a crowd of peasants. Marcus finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. The sight of his dropout daughter being ushered into the White House by a 4-star admiral triggered a desperate, hysterical panic inside his chest. The proximity to unimaginable power was right there, literally slipping through his fingers. His greed overrode his shock. He lunged forward again, pressing his chest aggressively against the velvet rope. "Wait!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking wildly, entirely devoid of his usual commanding lobbyist tone. "That is my daughter. Admiral, that is Camille Washington. I am her father. We are with her. Let us through right now." Two massive Secret Service agents immediately stepped forward, placing their heavy, tactical gloved hands squarely on Marcus's chest and shoving him roughly back into the sweating crowd. "Step back immediately, sir." The lead agent barked, his hand dropping menacingly to the holster at his hip. "You are in the general admission queue. Priority clearance guests are escorted first. Do not approach the barricade again, or your passes will be permanently confiscated and you will be detained." Marcus stumbled backward, crashing heavily into Brad. He looked around wildly, his chest heaving. The surrounding guests, the very people he had been desperately trying to impress and network with all afternoon, were now staring at him with a mixture of deep pity and severe annoyance. In that moment, he was not a powerful Washington broker. He was just a noisy, disruptive man in a rented tuxedo being manhandled by security, while his daughter walked the highly restricted halls of the Oval Office. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. I did not turn my head to offer them a single glance of vindication, anger, or pity. Looking back would imply that their presence still held some weight in my life. It would imply that I needed to see their horrified faces to validate my own success. But I was done seeking validation from a table where I was never truly invited. I walked alongside the Admiral, my sapphire gown sweeping elegantly across the pristine pavement as we crossed the threshold of the most secure building on the planet. The heavy reinforced steel gates of the White House perimeter swung shut behind me with a resounding metallic thud, permanently sealing Marcus Washington and his fragile, crumbling empire on the outside. The indignity of the standard security checkpoint took a full 45 minutes. By the time Marcus, Vivian, Jasmine, and Brad finally cleared the metal detectors, their carefully constructed veneers were entirely dissolved. The humid July evening had melted Vivian's makeup and ruined the sharp crease in Marcus's rented tuxedo trousers. They were ushered by stern, unsmiling guards away from the grand red carpeted central staircase and directed instead down a long, nondescript hallway toward the East Wing overflow reception area. This was not the room of power Marcus had promised. This was the holding pen. The overflow room was certainly opulent by standard definitions, boasting crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, but to anyone versed in the brutal hierarchy of Washington politics, it was a gilded cage for the irrelevant. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with low-level congressional staffers, junior aides, eager interns, and desperate mid-tier lobbyists trying to secure a 5-minute meeting with an undersecretary. There were no cabinet members here. There were no joint chiefs. The champagne being circulated on silver trays was a standard domestic vintage, a far cry from the top-tier labels served in the inner sanctums of the White House. Marcus grabbed a flute of warm champagne off a passing tray and downed it in one gulp. He frantically wiped his brow with a linen handkerchief, his eyes darting around the crowded room, desperately searching for a recognizable face of actual authority. He tried to project an air of commanding presence, standing tall and puffing out his chest, but his hands were shaking. The image of his daughter walking away with a 4-star admiral was burned into his retinas, short-circuiting his brain. He needed to prove to himself that he still mattered. He needed to prove that his Tier 3 VIP pass held actual weight. "This is exactly where we need to be," Marcus announced to his family, his voice unnaturally loud and strained. "The inner rooms are just for photo ops and ceremonial handshakes. This overflow area is where the real political ground game happens. This is where the actual deals are structured." No one believed him. Jasmine stood rigidly by a marble pillar, violently tugging at the seam of her secondary dress. She felt entirely invisible. For the first time in her life, the golden child of the Washington family was surrounded by people who did not care about her media law degree or her carefully polished aesthetic. Several junior aides brushed past her without a second glance, laughing and talking about policy briefs she did not understand. The crushing weight of her own mediocrity was finally settling over her shoulders. Brad was faring much worse. He was pacing a tight, frantic circle near the hors d'oeuvres station. The pastel button-down shirt he had worn with such arrogant pride at the cookout was now soaked through with cold, terrified sweat. He kept pulling his phone out of his pocket, swiping the screen with trembling fingers, only to stare at the same locked, blood-red warning banner. Aegis Protocol. The name flashed on his screen like a digital execution order. His venture capital firm was effectively deadlocked down by a sudden military security audit, and the CEO of the company responsible for his ruin was currently sitting in the Oval Office. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he desperately scanned the room for a lifeline. Vivian could not stomach the humiliation a second longer. Her social climbing instincts kicked into overdrive. She needed to assert her dominance. She needed to establish that her family belonged among the elite. Scanning the room, she spotted Beatrice, a prominent senator's wife known for her extensive charity galas and high society influence. Beatrice was standing near a floral arrangement, politely enduring a conversation with a junior state representative. Vivian straightened her posture, plastered on her most radiant, aggressive smile, and marched directly toward the senator's wife. "Beatrice, darling," Vivian called out smoothly, inserting herself into the conversation and completely ignoring the junior representative. "It is so wonderful to see you tonight." The decor is simply stunning, though I must say the crowd in this particular wing is a bit more junior than we are used to. Beatrice turned, offering Vivian a tight, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Vivian, hello? Yes, the East Wing is quite crowded this evening. Vivian leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. We are just making the rounds before the main award ceremony. I wanted to introduce you to my son-in-law, Bradley. He is the director of a major venture capital firm that was just awarded a $70 million Department of Defense logistics contract today. We are incredibly proud. Marcus facilitated the preliminary negotiations himself, of course. We are really stepping into the absolute top tier of federal defense contracting. Vivian waited for the gasp of admiration. She waited for Beatrice to recognize their immense financial power and immediately invite them into her exclusive social circle. Instead, Beatrice offered a soft, deeply patronizing laugh. A defense contract? How charming! It is always nice to see the mid-level firms getting a piece of the pie. Though I am afraid you are networking in the wrong room, Vivian. Vivian's smile froze. Excuse me. Beatrice gestured subtly toward the heavy guarded mahogany doors at the far end of the hall. Anyone holding a primary defense contract of actual significance is currently in a closed-door intelligence briefing in the Blue Room. The real VIPs, the heavy hitters shaping global policy, do not mingle in the overflow reception. They are preparing for the president's arrival. In fact, I believe the true guest of honor just arrived with Admiral Sterling, a brilliant young woman in the tech sector. The color drained from Vivian's face. Her stomach plummeted into her designer shoes. Now, if you will excuse me, Vivian, Beatrice said, stepping away with a dismissive nod. I promised my husband I would rescue him from the Agricultural Committee staffers. Enjoy the champagne. Vivian stood entirely alone in the middle of the crowded room, her social standing pulverized by a few polite aristocratic words. She turned back to look at her husband, her golden child daughter, and her supposedly wealthy son-in-law. They looked like a collection of pathetic, desperate imposters. Across the room, Brad stopped his frantic pacing. His wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto a figure entering the overflow room from a side corridor. It was a high-ranking Pentagon general, a man characterized by a chest full of medals and a severe, unyielding expression. This was the exact general who oversaw the very logistics and cybersecurity contracts that Brad's firm had just secured the preliminary bid for. This was the man holding the keys to the $70 million lifeline Brad desperately needed to survive the Aegis Protocol audit. Brad did not think. He did not strategize. Pure, unadulterated panic completely overrode his professional decorum. He shoved his phone into his pocket and bolted across the room. He pushed aggressively past a tray carrying waiter, sending 2 glasses of water crashing to the carpet, and ignored the annoyed shouts of the congressional staffers he shoved aside. He was a drowning man diving for a life preserver. He charged directly toward the Pentagon general, fully prepared to bypass every rule of Washington etiquette to secure a connection and save his rapidly crumbling ego. Brad intercepted the general with the frantic, aggressive energy of a predator that suddenly realized it was actually prey. He threw his shoulders back, forcing a wide, practiced smile onto his pale, sweating face. He extended a clammy hand directly into the general's personal space, completely disregarding the unwritten rules of military protocol and basic Washington etiquette. General Brad announced, his voice practically booming over the low hum of the overflow room. Bradley Sterling, Managing Director at Sterling Venture Capital. It is an absolute privilege to cross paths with you tonight. The general stopped. He was a man of iron posture and sharp, assessing eyes, wearing a chest full of ribbons that signified decades of actual sacrifice. He looked down at Brad's extended hand, then slowly brought his gaze up to Brad's panicked, bloodshot eyes. The general did not shake the hand. He merely clasped his own hands behind his back, exuding an aura of absolute, impenetrable authority. Sterling, the general repeated softly. The name seemed to leave a sour taste in his mouth. Brad forcefully dropped his hand, wiping his sweaty palm on the side of his trousers. He plowed ahead, fueled by pure, unadulterated desperation. Yes, sir. We are the firm that just secured the preliminary award for the Department of Defense Logistics and Cyber Infrastructure contract this morning. Marcus Washington facilitated the introduction. I know you oversee that division, and I just wanted to personally assure you that my team is ready to bring venture capital innovation to the Pentagon. We are going to disrupt the legacy systems and optimize your data flow. Brad waited for the nod of approval. He desperately needed the general to validate his existence, to welcome him into the brotherhood of federal contractors, to somehow magically override the terrifying red warning screen that had locked down his entire company just hours prior. Instead, the general looked at Brad with a profound, chilling sense of pity. It was the kind of look a seasoned veteran gives a soldier who has just stepped on a landmine and simply does not realize he is already dead. "You are the managing director of Sterling VC?" The general asked, his voice steady and dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir. We are very eager to finalize the paperwork and get to work on the infrastructure updates." Brad stammered, his confident facade cracking under the general's intense scrutiny. The general tilted his head slightly. "Son, you are not going to be updating anything. In fact, I am genuinely surprised you were allowed to keep your security clearance long enough to walk through the outer gates tonight." Brad felt the air completely leave his lungs, his vision blurred at the edges. "Excuse me, sir. I do not understand. We won the preliminary bid today. I signed the authorization myself." "That was your first mistake," the general said coldly, "and your last. By signing that preliminary authorization, you legally assumed total financial liability for your firm's current cybersecurity infrastructure. Are you aware of what happened to your network at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon?" Brad swallowed hard, tasting bile in the back of his throat. "We experienced a minor server glitch. My IT team is handling it. It is just a routine routing error." "It was not a glitch, Sterling. It was a Tier 1 military security audit. And your firm failed every single compliance metric on the spectrum." The general's voice cut through the noise of the room like a serrated blade. "Your firewalls were breached in 12 seconds. Your data encryption was rated as obsolete. You brought a paper shield to a digital war zone." Brad physically stumbled backward. The room began to spin. He reached out and gripped the edge of a cocktail table to keep his knees from buckling. "But we have the contract," he pleaded, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of his arrogant venture capitalist persona. "Marcus assured me the lobbying cleared the way. The funds are supposed to be transferred." The general let out a harsh, humorless breath. "There are no funds. You do not have a contract, son. You have a federal indictment waiting for you. The Department of Justice is currently freezing every liquid asset tied to your firm to recoup the damages caused by your gross negligence in handling classified logistics data. Your company is being liquidated by the federal government as we speak." Brad could not breathe. The walls of the ornate reception room were closing in on him. His luxury lifestyle, his expensive cars, his arrogant sense of superiority over his wife's family, it was all vanishing into thin air. He was bankrupt. He was facing federal prison. The crushing reality of his situation dropped him into a black hole of sheer terror. "Who did this?" Brad gasped, practically hyperventilating, his eyes wild and unhinged. "Who ordered the audit? I have rights. I have lawyers. Who authorized a military strike on a private firm?" The general looked at him with absolute disgust. The audit was triggered automatically by the overarching defense shield. Aegis Protocol flagged your servers for massive security breaches. They executed the lockdown command to protect federal assets from your incompetence. Aegis Protocol. The name hit Brad like a physical blow to the chest. It was the same name that had flashed across his locked computer screens. It was the same company that had bailed out his margin call. It was a faceless, invincible monolith that had systematically dismantled his entire life in a matter of hours. "Who the hell is in charge of Aegis Protocol?" Brad demanded, his voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "Who is running that company? I need to speak to them right now. I need to explain the situation." At that exact moment, the heavy gilded mahogany doors at the far end of the overflow room swung open. The muffled sounds of the reception area were instantly drowned out by the sweeping, majestic music echoing from the main ballroom. The grand event was commencing. The general straightened his posture, ignoring Brad's frantic desperation. He turned his attention toward the brilliant lights spilling out from the main hall. He raised his hand and pointed directly toward the grand entrance. "You should ask the CEO." The general said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable respect. "She is about to take the stage." The heavy mahogany doors swung open fully, revealing the breathtaking expanse of the main White House ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over a sea of high-ranking military officials, foreign dignitaries, and political titans. The stragglers from the overflow room were herded inside like cattle. Brad moved like a zombified shell of a man, his feet dragging across the plush carpet. He was entirely deaf to the majestic orchestral music swelling through the hall. His mind was trapped in an endless loop of his own impending federal prosecution. Marcus, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with aggressive ambition. He grabbed Vivian by the elbow and dragged her through the surging crowd, desperate to secure a vantage point. They were forcefully directed by stern ushers to the absolute back row of the cavernous room, relegated to standing room only behind rows of velvet-cushioned chairs reserved for actual decision-makers. The physical distance between the Washington family and the front stage was a perfect representation of their actual social standing. They were on the absolute fringe, desperately peering in. Jasmine stood next to her father, furiously pulling at her dress, glaring at the glittering diamonds and bespoke tailoring worn by the women seated in the front rows. She nudged Brad, demanding to know why he looked so pale, but Brad just stared blankly at the massive presidential seal mounted on the podium at the far end of the room. He could not speak. His vocal cords were paralyzed by sheer terror. He tried to open his mouth to warn them to scream that the venture capital firm was dead and the federal authorities were coming, but his throat was completely dry. Marcus leaned down his mouth, pressed close to Vivian's ear so he could be heard over the rising applause. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus whispered, his eyes locked on the empty stage. "The moment this ceremony concludes, we are pushing our way to the front. I do not care who we have to shove aside. The general just confirmed that Aegis Protocol is holding the keys to Brad's entire defense contract. If I can shake the hand of this CEO, if I can secure just 5 minutes of FaceTime, I can leverage my connections to lock in our family's wealth for the next 3 generations." Vivian nodded rapidly, her social climbing instincts overriding her earlier humiliation in the boutique. "We need this, Marcus. We need to show these people that the Washington family belongs in the inner circle. We have worked too hard to build our legacy to let a minor bureaucratic hiccup ruin Brad's career. We will invite this CEO to our country club. We will make her see that Brad is the perfect partner for her government contracts." Marcus adjusted his tie, a sharp sneer crossing his face. "Exactly. I refuse to let my hard work be overshadowed by that stunt Camille pulled at the security gates. I swear that ungrateful dropout exists only to embarrass me. She shows up in a rented dress trying to crash a federal event just to spite us. Once I secure this Aegis Protocol connection, I am cutting her off permanently. We do not need her dead weight dragging down our reputation in this city." A sudden sharp hush fell over the grand ballroom. The military orchestra ceased playing, replaced by the crisp, authoritative footsteps of the White House Chief of Staff walking onto the stage. He stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Even Marcus held his breath, his eyes wide with greedy anticipation. He stood on his tiptoes, trying to see over the shoulders of a 4-star general seated a few rows ahead. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," the Chief of Staff began, his voice echoing powerfully across the vast hall. "Tonight we are not just gathered to celebrate military might or diplomatic strategy. We are here to honor an entirely new breed of patriotism. Last month, our nation faced an unprecedented, highly coordinated cyber strike aimed directly at our central power grid. It was an attack designed to plunge millions of Americans into darkness, cripple our financial institutions, and paralyze our infrastructure." The crowd murmured in respectful, solemn acknowledgement. Marcus puffed out his chest, leaning forward with predatory focus. He was already rehearsing his introductory pitch, practicing the exact angle of his handshake. The attack failed. The chief of staff continued, his tone rising with profound admiration. It failed because of a defensive architecture so advanced, so impenetrable, that enemy operatives were locked out of our systems in less than 14 seconds. We call this shield the Iron Canopy. It was not built by a government agency. It was not designed by a room full of traditional Pentagon contractors. It was engineered by a single brilliant civilian mind. A woman whose unparalleled genius and fierce dedication to this country have redefined modern warfare. A wave of electrifying anticipation swept through the ballroom. Brad's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the back of the chair in front of him, his knuckles turning stark white. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He knew exactly what was coming, and he was completely powerless to stop the impending execution. Marcus nudged Vivian violently, his eyes gleaming with feverish excitement. "Get ready," he whispered frantically. "Memorize this CEO's face. We are going straight for her the second the clapping stops. Do not let anyone block our path." The chief of staff looked up from his notes, sweeping his gaze across the audience of generals, senators, and global leaders. "It is my profound honor to introduce the architect of the Iron Canopy. Please stand and welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Protocol." The massive double doors at the side of the stage swung open. The blinding spotlight shifted, illuminating the figure stepping out from the shadows. "Please welcome," the chief of staff announced, his voice ringing with absolute reverence, Dr. Camille Washington. The entire ballroom rose as one synchronized entity. The thunderous applause was a physical wave of sound echoing off the gilded ceiling and bouncing against the marble columns. I stepped out from the shadowed wings and into the blinding, brilliant pool of the center spotlight. The midnight blue velvet of the custom Maison de Laurent gown flowed flawlessly around me. The thousands of hand-stitched sapphire crystals caught the rapid flashes of dozens of press cameras, igniting like a galaxy suspended in the dark. I did not shrink from the attention. I did not rush my steps to get it over with. I walked with the measured, deliberate cadence of a woman who commanded the digital infrastructure of the free world. As I approached the center of the stage, I saw the Secretary of Defense standing in the front row, offering a sharp, respectful nod. Next to him, the Director of National Intelligence was clapping vigorously with a wide smile. This was not polite, obligatory applause for a generic guest speaker. This was absolute, undeniable reverence for a savior. In the absolute back row of the Grand Hall, squeezed tightly behind a row of thick velvet ropes, the Washington family experienced a collective, catastrophic psychological collapse. Marcus stared at the stage, his eyes bulging so far out of his skull they looked completely unmoored from reality. The confident, booming lobbyist persona had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He looked like someone who had just watched the laws of physics reverse themselves. The daughter he had called an ugly, arrogant dropout, the woman he had banished to the backyard grill like a servant, was currently being worshipped by the very politicians he spent his entire life begging for table scraps. Next to him, Vivian found that her meticulously manicured fingers had gone completely numb. The crystal flute of domestic champagne she was holding slipped right through her grasp. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending shards of glass and cheap wine splashing across the polished stone. She did not even blink. She could not breathe. Her chest heaved in shallow, panicked gasps as she stared at the $25,000 gown she had mocked just hours prior. Jasmine swayed on her feet, the blood rushing entirely out of her head. She gripped the back of the chair in front of her to stop herself from collapsing into a dead faint. Her prestigious media law degree suddenly felt like a worthless piece of paper compared to the sheer magnitude of what she was witnessing. Brad simply closed his eyes, accepting the cold, dark reality of his looming federal indictment. I reached the massive mahogany podium and adjusted the microphone. I raised a single hand, and the roaring applause of the room instantly died down to an absolute, breathless hush. I looked out over the sea of decorated military uniforms and designer evening wear. "Thank you," I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. "It is an immense privilege to stand before you tonight, not just as the founder of Aegis Protocol, but as a citizen dedicated to the preservation of our nation's digital sovereignty." When we began architecting the iron canopy, the directive was clear. We were facing an adversary that did not sleep, did not negotiate, and did not attack our physical borders. They targeted our vulnerabilities, the invisible interconnected networks that keep our hospitals running, our financial sectors stable, and our military communications secure. I spoke for 15 minutes without ever looking down at a prompter. I commanded the room with absolute authority, breaking down the complex algorithms and tactical deployments that had neutralized the massive state-sponsored hack. I spoke of unyielding perimeters, of identifying weak points in legacy systems, and of the ruthless necessity of cutting off compromised assets before they could infect the entire network. Every general, every senator, every foreign diplomat hung on my every word. The power in the room belonged entirely to me, and I wielded it flawlessly. As I reached the final segment of my address, the press cameras flashed in a continuous blinding wave of white light. I lifted my chin, letting my gaze sweep slowly over the front rows of dignitaries. I moved my focus back through the affluent crowd, past the dedicated press pool, all the way to the absolute rear of the cavernous ballroom. I bypassed the faces of strangers and locked eyes directly with the four people standing frozen in the overflow section. I stared straight into Marcus Washington's terrified, desperate eyes. I did not smile. I did not scowl. I offered him a look of absolute chilling emptiness. I watched my father visibly flinch under the heavy, suffocating weight of my stare. I watched my mother shrink behind his shoulder, desperately wishing she could disappear into the shadows. I held their gaze, trapping them in the brilliant spotlight of their own spectacular failure. I ensured they understood that I saw them exactly where they belonged, at the very back of the room, powerless and irrelevant. I grasped the edges of the wooden podium, letting the heavy silence stretch for one final agonizing second before delivering my closing remarks. The defense of this nation requires eternal vigilance, I said, my voice ringing with a sharp, undeniable finality. It requires the courage to identify your vulnerabilities and the absolute strength to eliminate them without hesitation. I want to thank my brilliant team at Aegis Protocol, the Joint Chiefs, and the brave men and women of our Cyber Command. But most importantly, I want to thank those who taught me the fundamental laws of security. I leaned forward slightly, never breaking eye contact with the terrified faces in the back row. I learned how to build impenetrable defenses by being shown time and time again that sometimes the greatest threats to your survival come from within your own house. The thunderous applause rolled through the grand ballroom long after I stepped away from the heavy mahogany podium. As I descended the short flight of velvet-carpeted stairs, the formal structure of the evening immediately dissolved into a chaotic, high-stakes networking frenzy. The most powerful political and military figures in the free world surged forward, completely abandoning their usual rehearsed decorum. A swarm of senators, defense contractors, and four-star generals pressed in, all desperate to secure a handshake or a photograph with the civilian who held the keys to the nation's digital survival. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging brief strategic pleasantries. The press pool cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every interaction. I was completely in my element, surrounded by individuals who understood the currency of true power. But from the periphery of my vision, I detected a disruption. It was not the smooth, calculated approach of a Washington insider. It was the frantic, aggressive thrashing of a drowning man. Marcus Washington was violently elbowing his way through the dense sea of elite guests. He was physically shoving junior aides and foreign diplomats aside, leaving a wake of offended gasps and spilled champagne. He dragged my mother by the wrist, her designer heels stumbling over the thick carpet, while Jasmine and Brad trailed closely behind like terrified shadows. The desperate hunger radiating from my father was palpable. He had witnessed the standing ovation. He had seen the Secretary of Defense nod in my direction. In his calculating, opportunistic mind, my staggering success was no longer a threat to his ego. It was a golden ticket to save his crumbling lobbying career and salvage his son-in-law's doomed firm. As he breached the inner circle of dignitaries surrounding me, Marcus threw his arms open wide. He plastered on a massive theatrical smile that stretched his face into a grotesque mask of fake booming pride. He let out a loud, roaring laugh, designed specifically to capture the attention of every reporter and camera lens within a 50-foot radius. "That is my daughter Marcus," shouted his voice aggressively loud, completely shattering the refined hum of the reception. "That is my brilliant girl. I always knew you were destined to change the world, Camille. Come here and give your father a hug." He lunged forward, intending to wrap his arms around me and pull me into a highly publicized embrace. He wanted the photograph. He desperately needed the visual proof of his proximity to my power to splash across every political blog and newspaper in the district. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I simply took one smooth, fluid step backward. Before Marcus could close the distance, my federal security detail moved with terrifying precision. Two towering agents in dark suits instantly stepped into the void I had created. They formed an impenetrable physical wall of muscle and Kevlar right in front of the flashing cameras. Marcus crashed directly into the chest of the lead agent, his forced theatrical smile instantly dropping into a look of absolute shock. The agent did not push him, but stood like a mountain of stone, completely halting my father's desperate advance. "Sir, keep your distance from the director," the agent stated, his voice a low mechanical rumble that carried no emotion. "Step back immediately." Marcus scrambled backward, his face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. The surrounding senators and generals fell silent, their eyes darting between the disgraced lobbyist and my impenetrable security wall. Marcus quickly looked at the cameras, desperately trying to salvage the narrative. He let out a nervous, strained chuckle, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Of course," Marcus stammered, his voice trembling as he tried to maintain his fake, jovial facade. "The security protocols are completely understandable. We just wanted to congratulate our girl. We are so incredibly proud of everything you have built, sweetheart. The entire Washington family is just bursting with pride." I stared at him from behind the wall of federal agents. The sheer audacity of his performance was breathtaking. Less than 5 hours ago, this same man had ordered me off his patio, called me an ugly dropout, and demanded I apologize for breathing the same air as his precious wealthy son-in-law. Now cornered by his own greed and impending ruin, he was begging for a public association he had spent 7 years actively rejecting. I did not offer him a single word of recognition. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out, allowing every powerful person in the room to witness his desperate, pathetic groveling. Seeing that Marcus was failing to secure the connection they desperately needed, Vivian violently pushed her way to the front. My mother looked entirely unhinged. Her carefully maintained socialite persona was completely gone. Her hair was frizzy from the humidity, her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. She grabbed the edge of the security agent's suit jacket, her knuckles turning white. "Camille, sweetheart, please," Vivian pleaded, her voice shaking with raw, undisguised desperation. The cameras continued to flash, capturing her total meltdown, but she no longer cared about the optics. She only cared about survival. We had absolutely no idea. "We did not know you were running Aegis Protocol. If we had known, we never would have said those things at the house today. You have to believe us. We are so proud of you." I watched a single tear streak down my mother's cheek, ruining her expensive foundation. It was the first time she had ever cried in my presence, and it was entirely for her own self-preservation. "Please, Camille," Vivian begged, her voice cracking as she gestured wildly toward the pale, sweating figure of Brad, standing paralyzed behind her. "You have to introduce Brad to the Admiral right now. You have to fix this contract issue. The government is freezing all his accounts. They are going to take everything we have built. You have the power to stop this. Please save your family." I looked down at the tears ruining my mother's expensive makeup. The sheer desperation in her voice was a symphony of poetic justice, but it moved nothing inside me. The elite crowd surrounding us watched the spectacle with a mixture of profound fascination and deep aristocratic disgust. In Washington, you could be ruthless, you could be cunning, but you could never be publicly pathetic. My family was currently breaking the cardinal rule of high society, broadcasting their spectacular ruin under the crystal chandeliers of the White House. I shifted my gaze away from Vivian's reaching hands and looked directly at Bradley Sterling. The transformation of my brother-in-law was an absolute masterpiece of karmic retribution. The arrogant, untouchable venture capitalist who had casually tossed his Porsche keys at my chest just hours ago no longer existed. In his place stood a broken, hyperventilating shell of a man. The pastel button-down shirt he wore beneath his designer finance vest was completely saturated with dark, cold sweat. His hands shook violently at his sides. The condescending white savior smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face for the last 7 years was entirely gone, replaced by the wide, hollow stare of a man staring down the barrel of his own execution. Brad forcefully pushed his way past my sobbing mother and my paralyzed father. He stumbled until he hit the invisible wall of my Secret Service detail, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Camille Brad choked out his voice, cracking into a high, reedy pitch that carried clearly across the silent ballroom. Please, you have to call off the Aegis command. You have to lift the security lock on my servers. He did not care that the Secretary of Defense was standing less than 10 feet away. He did not care that the White House press pool was documenting every second of his humiliation. Pure, unadulterated terror had stripped away every ounce of his pride. I am begging you, Brad stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the unmoving federal agents. The margin call from last week drained our reserve capital. We are leveraged to the absolute brink. I used the preliminary defense contract as collateral to secure an emergency bridge loan this morning. If the federal government freezes our accounts because of this security audit, the bank will instantly call in the loan. We do not have the liquidity. I will be bankrupt by midnight. I will lose the firm, the house, the cars, everything. He was confessing his total financial insolvency to the very woman he had called a useless dropout. He was admitting that his entire empire of wealth was nothing but a fragile house of cards held together by aggressive debt and massive blinding ego. I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic confession hang in the opulent air. I wanted the generals, the senators, and the corporate titans in the room to hear exactly what kind of fraudulent, incompetent businessman Marcus Washington had brought to the gates of power. Your financial leverage is not a federal concern, Brad, I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that made him flinch. And your inability to secure your own data networks is a profound liability to the United States government. You assumed you could bluff your way through a Tier 1 military contract. You assumed the rules did not apply to you. You were wrong. I turned my back on his sweating, pathetic face. I reached into the midnight blue velvet clutch resting in my hand. My fingers brushed past my encrypted phone and closed around a sleek, matte black biometric flash drive. I withdrew the drive and held it up the small metallic casing, catching the brilliant light of the chandeliers. I bypassed my family entirely and stepped toward Admiral James Sterling, who had been watching the entire exchange with a grim, unwavering focus. I extended my hand, presenting the drive to the highest-ranking cyber warfare officer in the military. Admiral, I announced, my voice carrying the crisp professional cadence of a commanding officer delivering a tactical strike report. This drive contains the automated Tier 1 security audit of Sterling Venture Capital. The preliminary review executed by Aegis Protocol is complete. The Admiral reached out and took the drive, his gloved hand closing securely around the data. I turned slightly, ensuring my voice carried to the press pool and the surrounding intelligence directors. They failed every single compliance metric required by the Department of Defense. Their localized servers were breached by our automated red team in 12 seconds. Furthermore, the audit confirms they have already compromised highly classified federal logistics data due to gross, inexcusable negligence. The collective sharp intake of breath from the surrounding military brass was audible. Compromising federal data was not a civil matter. It was a severe federal crime. Brad let out a strangled, breathless sound sounding like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. He staggered backward, clutching his chest. The Admiral placed the flash drive into the breast pocket of his decorated uniform. He gave me a sharp, definitive nod. Thank you, Director Washington. I will have the Department of Justice and the Federal Cyber Command process this data immediately. Arrest warrants will be drafted before morning. I turned my attention back to Brad. He was staring at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto his knees right there on the pristine marble floor of the White House, his expensive tailored trousers pooling around him as he stared up at the woman who had just systematically dismantled his entire life. "You wanted to give me a $40,000 help desk job?" I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet whisper that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "You wanted to toss me a few pennies so you could feel like a savior while calling me a failure in my parents' dining room." I looked down at his trembling, pathetic form, feeling nothing but the cold, satisfying absolute zero of perfect justice. "I am giving you a 0, I stated flatly. "Your firm is liquidated as of 5 minutes ago. You are permanently blacklisted from the defense sector." The echo of my final judgment over Bradley Sterling hung heavily in the air of the White House ballroom. Brad remained on his knees on the polished marble floor. He was gasping for air. His manicured hands gripped his hair in a state of absolute shattered ruin. The arrogant venture capitalist who had mocked my very existence just hours ago was now nothing more than a cautionary tale weeping openly in front of the Secretary of Defense. I shifted my gaze to the man who had orchestrated this entire disastrous family outing. Marcus Washington was staring at the weeping mess on the floor. The gears inside my father's head were grinding with violent intensity. I watched the exact moment his panic crystallized into a cold, ruthless calculation. For the past 7 years, Marcus had worshipped the ground Brad walked on. He had praised Brad at every family dinner, elevated his status, and treated him like the golden son he never had. He had done all of this for one simple reason. Brad represented proximity to wealth. But now that wealth was entirely gone, Brad was no longer an asset. He was a radioactive liability facing federal prosecution. Marcus did not kneel to comfort his son-in-law. He did not offer a hand to help the man up. He did not even look at his eldest daughter, Jasmine, who was currently sobbing against a marble pillar, as she watched her luxurious lifestyle evaporate in real time. Instead, Marcus physically stepped away from them. He smoothed the lapels of his rented tuxedo, adjusted his posture, and completely severed his emotional ties to his favorite child's husband in the span of 3 seconds. His survival instinct, honed by decades of cutthroat Washington lobbying, completely overrode whatever microscopic shred of paternal loyalty he possessed. He only loved power. And right now, the ultimate power in the room was standing directly in front of him wearing a sapphire gown. Marcus took a deliberate step toward my security perimeter. He plastered a slick, desperate smile across his face. It was the exact smile he used when cornering vulnerable senators at fundraising galas. "Camille," Marcus began. His voice was smooth, completely devoid of the rage he had displayed at the security gates. It was a terrifyingly fast pivot. "I always knew Brad was reckless. I told your mother just last week that his firm was dangerously over-leveraged. He lacked the discipline required for this city. He was a fool to think he could bypass federal compliance. You did the right thing by shutting him down. He was a massive risk to national security." Jasmine let out a piercing, strangled cry. She fell to her knees beside her ruined husband, grabbing his shoulders, but her eyes were locked on her father in pure horror. She was witnessing the absolute destruction of her safety net, and the man who was supposed to protect her was actively pouring gasoline on the fire. Vivian covered her mouth with both hands, her entire body shaking as the realization set in. Her husband had zero loyalty to anyone but himself. Marcus did not even glance down at his weeping daughter. He ignored Vivian entirely. He pressed forward, his eyes locked onto mine with a ravenous, greedy hunger. "But you, Camille, you are an absolute visionary. You have built an empire right under our noses. $2 billion in federal contracts is unprecedented for a private intelligence firm, but you know exactly how Washington operates. Technology is only half the battle. You need relationships. You need someone who can navigate the complex labyrinth of Capitol Hill, someone who can secure the defense appropriations committees and keep the regulatory agencies completely off your back." He puffed out his chest, stepping as close to the Secret Service agents as he dared. "You need a dedicated, highly experienced lobbyist representing Aegis Protocol, someone who will protect your interests with absolute loyalty because his own blood is on the line. We can keep the wealth in the family, Camille. With my connections in the Senate and your digital infrastructure, we will absolutely dominate the defense sector. We will be the most powerful dynasty in this district. I stared at the man who had contributed half my DNA. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his pitch was almost impressive. Less than 12 hours ago, he had screamed in my face, calling me a useless dropout. He had banished me from his dining table. He had tried to have me arrested at the perimeter gates. Now he was standing over the metaphorical corpse of his son-in-law, eagerly offering to manage my billions. He did not feel an ounce of remorse for how he had treated me. He only felt profound regret that he had not realized my net worth sooner. He was a parasite desperately trying to detach from a dying host and latch onto a thriving one. I let his desperate pitch echo into the silence of the room. The surrounding military officials watched him with open, unvarnished disgust. The senators he had spent his entire life trying to impress were now staring at him like he was vermin. They recognized a political scavenger when they saw one. "You talk about loyalty, Marcus," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling, absolute weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "You talk about protecting family interests. Yet you are currently standing over a man you called your only true provider, aggressively negotiating for a job, before his tears have even dried on the floor. Your concept of loyalty is entirely transactional. It expires the exact second a bank account runs dry." Marcus swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Camille, be reasonable. Business is business. I am offering you a strategic alliance. We are family." I raised my right hand, making a brief, sharp gesture to the shadows just behind the stage. Xavier, my chief operating officer, stepped forward smoothly from the perimeter. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a former intelligence director. He bypassed the Secret Service detail and stopped directly beside me. He was holding a thick, heavy manila folder. I took the folder from Xavier's hands. The heavy paper felt solid and definitive against my fingertips. I looked back down at Marcus. The greedy anticipation in his eyes slowly began to curdle into a deep, primal panic. He looked at the folder, then back up at my face. He finally realized that the execution I had just performed on Bradley Sterling was not the main event. It was simply the opening act. "I do not need a lobbyist, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "But you are going to need a very good criminal defense attorney." I extended my arm and pressed the heavy manila folder directly against Marcus's chest. For a moment, his hands remained paralyzed at his sides. He stared at the thick envelope as if it were a live explosive device. The predatory greed that had animated him just moments prior vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I did not move. I simply pushed the folder harder against his starched tuxedo shirt until his survival instinct finally kicked in, and his trembling fingers closed around the thick cardboard. "Open it," I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient hum of the grand ballroom. Marcus fumbled with the metal clasp. His hands were shaking so violently that the folder slipped from his grasp, half of its contents spilling out onto the polished marble floor. High-resolution satellite photos, bank routing numbers, and encrypted communication logs cascaded over his expensive leather shoes. He dropped to his knees, frantically scrambling to gather the papers before anyone else could see them. But the damage was already done. The document resting right on top of the pile was a printed transcript of a secured phone call he had made at 6 o'clock this morning. It detailed an illegal wire transfer of $500,000 to an offshore account, controlled by a shadow political action committee linked directly to Senator Hastings. Right below that transcript was the signed, digitized agreement, detailing the exact bribe Marcus had offered to steer the $70 million Department of Defense logistics contract away from its rightful winner and hand it directly to his son-in-law. I looked down at him as he frantically shuffled the papers, his breathing ragged and shallow. "You spent the last month engaging in blatant federal bribery, Marcus. You leveraged every ounce of your political capital to sabotage a company called Apex Solutions. You wanted to crush them so Brad could secure the preliminary bid and fund your family's lavish lifestyle. What you failed to realize in your desperate scramble for wealth and status was that Apex Solutions is a subsidiary of Aegis Protocol. You were actively bribing a United States senator to steal a federal contract from your own daughter." Marcus froze on his hands and knees. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow out his very soul. He realized the trap I had set. He realized I had watched him build his own gallows, tie the noose, and willingly place his own neck inside. The man who prided himself on knowing every backroom deal in Washington had been entirely outmaneuvered by the child he considered a failure. "This is a misunderstanding." Marcus stammered, his voice a pathetic high-pitched wheeze that barely carried over the music. He clutched the papers to his chest, trying to stand up, but completely lacking the strength in his legs. "Camille, you have to listen to me. I was just negotiating. This is how Washington works. It is just aggressive lobbying. I can fix this. I can make this go away right now. We can bury this file and keep the money in the family." "You cannot bury what has already been unearthed," I said, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. I did not just bring this folder to the White House to prove a point. I handed authenticated, digitally verified copies of every single document in your hands to the Department of Justice at 8 o'clock this morning. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has already seized your offshore accounts. They have the wire transfers. They have the audio recordings of your bribes. Your career in this district is officially over. The surrounding crowd of dignitaries, generals, and politicians physically recoiled. The word bribery rippled through the elite audience like a shockwave. Men and women Marcus had spent decades brown-nosing, the very people he desperately wanted to invite to his country club, suddenly turned their backs. They stepped away in unison to ensure they were not captured in the same camera frame as a man facing imminent federal indictment. He was instantly, irrevocably toxic. A political leper in the very room he had sacrificed his own daughter to enter. Behind him, the crushing reality of the situation finally penetrated Jasmine's shock. She looked down at Brad, still weeping on the floor, bankrupt and facing his own prison sentence. She looked at her father, clutching the evidence of his federal crimes, stripped of his lobbying license and his social standing. The two men who funded her designer clothes, her luxury vehicles, and her entire identity as a superior, wealthy Washington socialite were completely systematically destroyed. The generational wealth she had been promised was gone. The elite status she had wielded like a weapon against me her entire life had evaporated into thin air. Jasmine let out a piercing, guttural scream. The sound tore through the elegant ballroom, shattering any remaining semblance of high society decorum. She lunged forward, pushing past our mother, her face contorted with a frantic, unhinged rage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her chest heaving as the last remnants of her perfect golden child persona shattered into a million pieces. "You set us up!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. "You planned all of this from the very beginning. You knew Brad would fail that military audit. You knew Dad was lobbying against your company. You let them do it. You let them destroy themselves. You ruined our lives on purpose." "I did not set you up, Jasmine. I simply stopped shielding you from the consequences of your own arrogant choices. You built a lavish lifestyle on the back of a fraud. You wore designer gowns funded by a man who could not even secure a basic defense firewall. You lived in a fragile glass house, and instead of reinforcing the walls, you threw stones at the only person who actually knew how to build a solid foundation. I did not ruin your life. I just let gravity do its job." The absolute truth of my words hit Jasmine with the force of a physical blow. She crumpled to the floor beside her weeping husband, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of her new impoverished existence fully washed over her. Vivian could not handle the spectacular destruction of her two golden children. The total collapse of her carefully curated social empire broke whatever fragile restraint she had left. She lunged forward, bypassing the broken figure of my father and the weeping frame of my sister. She reached out with trembling hands, her manicured acrylic nails digging desperately into the midnight blue velvet sleeve of my couture gown. She was sobbing hysterically, her elite high society persona completely dissolving into a messy, frantic display of pure desperation. "Camille, please," Vivian wailed, her voice cracking, as tears streamed down her ruined makeup. "You have to stop this right now. You have to call the Attorney General. Tell them it was a massive mistake. You cannot do this to your own family. Blood is thicker than water, Camille. We are your blood. I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot send your father to federal prison. You cannot leave your sister with absolutely nothing. We are the Washingtons. We stick together. Please, you have to take it all back. I looked down at the trembling hands clutching my arm. For decades, a single disapproving glance from this woman had the power to make me feel entirely worthless. I used to crave her validation so desperately that I accepted her toxic conditional affection as a substitute for actual maternal love. But standing here under the brilliant chandeliers of the White House, watching her weep for the loss of her social status while masquerading it as family loyalty, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well had completely run dry. There was no anger left in my heart, there was no sorrow, there was only absolute zero. I raised my opposite hand and gently but firmly detached her trembling fingers from my sleeve. I stepped back, smoothing the velvet fabric where she had desperately grabbed me. I looked down at her tear-stained face with complete and total emotional detachment. You told me I was not invited to this table, I said, my voice echoing with a chilling, undeniable finality. You told me I was an embarrassment who had no place among the elite. You told me to go home before I ruined your perfect image. You were right, Vivian. I am not invited to your table, because this is my table now. I did not wait for her to process the absolute finality of my words. I took a deliberate step backward into the secure perimeter of my personal guard and raised 2 fingers in the air. The response was instantaneous. The heavy wall of federal agents surrounding me instantly tightened their protective circle. The Secret Service agents assigned to monitor the East Room immediately converged on our location. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision, forming a tight, inescapable ring around the weeping, broken remnants of my family. These individuals are causing a severe public disturbance, I announced, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the surrounding crowd of generals, senators, and foreign dignitaries. Furthermore, they entirely lack the appropriate federal security clearance to remain in this restricted wing. Please remove them from the premises immediately. The command struck the room like a gavel pounding on a judicial block. The Secret Service agents did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They stepped forward in unison, laying firm, unyielding hands on the shoulders and arms of my father, my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. Marcus tried to physically shake off the agent gripping his tuxedo jacket. He opened his mouth to protest, to shout about his lobbying connections and his political leverage, but a second agent immediately flanked him, applying a joint compliance hold to his elbow that instantly silenced his objections. Brad did not even try to stand on his own. 2 guards had to physically haul him up by his armpits, dragging his limp, weeping body across the polished marble. Jasmine covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as she was marched forward. Vivian stumbled on her designer heels, wailing my name over and over again, begging for a rescue that would never come. The walk of shame was excruciatingly slow and completely public. Every single high-ranking official, wealthy donor, and international diplomat in the grand ballroom turned to watch the spectacle. The elite society that Marcus and Vivian had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress now stared at them with unvarnished disgust. Senators turned their backs. Military leaders scoffed. Socialites whispered behind their hands, cementing the total, irrevocable destruction of the Washington family name. I stood beside the 4-star admiral and the Secretary of Defense, watching my family being forcefully marched through the sea of powerful elites. They were paraded out of the grand ballroom, dragged down the long, opulent hallways, and physically ejected through the heavy security doors of the White House. They were shoved out into the sweltering, humid Washington night, permanently exiled from the halls of power, leaving behind nothing but the shattered pieces of their own toxic arrogance. 3 weeks. That is exactly how long it takes for a fraudulent empire to burn completely to the studs. 3 weeks since the heavy mahogany doors of the White House slammed shut on the Washington legacy, permanently severing their connection to power, wealth, and basic societal relevance. The federal government typically operates with agonizing slowness, but when the chief architect of the nation's cyber defense grid personally hands the Department of Justice a fully authenticated, digitally verified folder of federal crimes, the wheels of justice spin with terrifying lethal velocity. Marcus Washington did not just lose his lobbying firm, he was entirely obliterated from the political map. The morning after the gala, a fleet of black tactical vans belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation pulled up to his prestigious downtown office. Armed federal agents walked out carrying every single hard drive server and physical ledger in the building. His license to practice lobbying was immediately suspended pending permanent disbarment. The man who had spent his entire adult life bragging about having powerful senators on speed dial now found himself wearing a bulky federal ankle monitor, confined entirely to the perimeter of his Potomac estate, while awaiting trial for bribery, wire fraud, and corporate sabotage. Every politician he had ever courted issued rapid, aggressive public statements denying any association with him. He was a political ghost, haunting a mansion he could no longer afford. The fallout for Bradley Sterling was equally catastrophic and vastly more humiliating. The Tier 1 military security audit executed by Aegis Protocol did exactly what I promised it would do. It triggered a total non-negotiable liquidation of his venture capital firm. The federal government seized the corporate accounts, the offshore funds, the luxury vehicles, and the commercial real estate. Brad filed for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy just 8 days after dropping to his knees on the White House floor. His arrogant white savior complex dissolved into nothingness as he was stripped of his wealth and his power. Jasmine, realizing that her pristine golden parachute was actually an anvil tied to her ankles, did not hesitate. The golden child of the Washington family, the woman who had proudly enabled my abuse as long as it kept her wrapped in designer clothes, filed for divorce less than 96 hours after Brad's firm collapsed. But leaving a sinking ship does not guarantee a safe landing. Because her lavish lifestyle had been entirely funded by Brad's fraudulent corporate accounts and Marcus's illegal lobbying money, Jasmine walked away with absolutely nothing. The prestigious media lawyer who had scoffed at a $40,000 salary now found herself signing a lease on a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. There was no valet, there were no crystal chandeliers. She had to move her sparse remaining belongings in cheap cardboard boxes because the federal authorities had seized her collection of designer luggage during the asset freeze. She was entirely alone, desperately sending out resumes for entry-level legal assistant jobs just to keep the lights on, utterly abandoned by the socialite friends who used to drink her husband's expensive champagne. But the most agonizing punishment of all fell squarely on the shoulders of Vivian Washington. For my mother, financial ruin was terrifying, but social exile was a fate worse than death. Her entire identity, her absolute core existence was built on her status within the highly exclusive, heavily gate-kept circles of the D.C. Black elite. She worshipped the prestigious alumni associations, the Jack and Jill chapter meetings, and the upscale country club luncheons. Desperate to maintain some fragile illusion of normalcy, Vivian put on her finest vintage Chanel suit, clasped her signature pearls around her neck, and drove to the most anticipated social event of the summer. It was an exclusive invitation-only alumni luncheon held at the heavily guarded Congressional Country Club. She stepped out of her vehicle, plastering on the same radiant artificial smile she had used to mask her cruelty for decades. She walked up the sweeping stone steps, fully intending to spin the federal indictments as a massive bureaucratic misunderstanding. She approached the registration desk in the grand foyer, greeting the chapter president, a wealthy judge's wife named Beatrice, with wide open arms. Beatrice did not smile back. She did not reach out to accept the embrace. She stood perfectly still, her face an unyielding mask of aristocratic ice. Two formidable security guards flanked the registration table, their eyes locked directly on Vivian. Vivian, Beatrice said, her voice carrying the chilling, precise cadence of a formal eviction. "You are not on the guest list." Vivian's artificial smile faltered, her hands dropping awkwardly to her sides. Beatrice, darling, there must be a clerical error. I RSVP'd a month ago. My table is usually right near the garden windows. There is no error, Beatrice replied loudly enough for the surrounding women in pastel dresses and wide-brimmed hats to hear clearly. The board of directors held an emergency vote last Tuesday. Your membership to this organization, along with your access to all affiliated country clubs and social registers, has been permanently revoked. The blood drained entirely from Vivian's face. The foyer went dead silent. The women Vivian had spent decades gossiping with the women she had desperately tried to impress by belittling her own daughter now stared at her with unvarnished disgust. They had all seen the leaked footage of the White House perimeter. They all knew the truth. They knew Vivian had raised a daughter who built a billion-dollar national security empire, and she had alienated, abused, and publicly rejected that daughter to the point of a spectacular public execution. In the ruthless hierarchy of elite society, you simply do not survive being a national embarrassment. You are no longer welcome here, Vivian, Beatrice stated with absolute finality. Please leave the premises immediately before we are forced to have you escorted out for trespassing. Vivian could not speak. Her throat closed up, choking on the bitter, suffocating ash of her own ruined social empire. She turned around and stumbled back down the sweeping stone steps, the heavy, judgmental silence of her former peers burning into her back. She practically fell into the driver's seat of her aging sedan, the only vehicle the federal government had allowed her to keep. The sweltering July heat beat down on the country club parking lot, turning the car into a suffocating oven. Vivian gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning stark white as the pristine Chanel suit clung to her sweating skin. The crushing, inescapable weight of her total isolation finally broke her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, frantic, desperate sobs. She had sacrificed her own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that had just permanently banished her. With trembling, frantic fingers, she reached into her designer purse and pulled out her phone. Her vision blurred with hot tears as she scrolled through her contacts and tapped my name. She pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the agonizing rhythmic tone of the ringing line. It was the 50th time she had dialed my number that week, desperate for a handout, for a sliver of relevance, for a tiny fraction of the daughter she had completely thrown away. Exactly 1 year later, the oppressive July heat returned to choke the streets of Washington. But inside the executive penthouse of Aegis Protocol, the climate was perfectly calibrated. I sat behind my massive obsidian glass desk, my posture relaxed, bathed in the natural light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. From this altitude, the United States Capitol building looked like a meticulously crafted architectural model resting on a bed of lush green trees. The frantic, desperate scrambling of politicians and lobbyists on the streets below was entirely invisible to me. Up here there was only silence, order, and absolute control. A soft, melodic chime broke the quiet of my office. I pressed a single button on my encrypted console. Director Washington. My executive assistant, Chloe, said, her voice completely professional, but laced with a faint trace of hesitation. I apologize for the interruption. It is line 1 again. Vivian Washington is calling. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers. Is she leaving another voicemail, Chloe? Yes, ma'am. It is the 12th attempt this week. She is weeping. She is asking for just 5 minutes of your time to discuss a potential reconciliation. She mentioned that her current living situation has become untenable and she desperately needs a short-term loan to secure an apartment. The image of my mother weeping into a phone from whatever modest, isolated corner she had been banished to flickered through my mind. Over the past 12 months, the karmic leveling of the Washington family had been absolute and entirely self-inflicted. Marcus was currently confined to a medium-security federal facility, serving a 5-year sentence for bribery and corporate espionage. Brad was managing a failing retail electronics store in a dying suburban mall, drowning in unshakable debt. Jasmine was working as a junior paralegal for a strip mall traffic lawyer, stripped of her designer wardrobe and her unearned arrogance. And Vivian, the woman who had worshipped the social elite with religious fervor, had been completely erased from high society. She had lost her sprawling Potomac estate to foreclosure. She had lost her country club memberships, her friends, and her identity. She was exactly what she had always feared becoming. She was irrelevant. A year ago, listening into her desperate sobbing pleas might have brought me a dark, vindictive sense of satisfaction. I might have picked up the phone just to hear the complete destruction of her pride. I might have twisted the knife to punish her for every single time she made me feel small, ugly, and worthless. But as I sat in the highest office of a multi-billion-dollar empire, looking at the blinking red light on my console, I searched my heart for a trace of anger. I searched for bitterness. I searched for that familiar childhood ache that desperately craved a mother's validation. I found absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely dry. The toxic, suffocating cord that had tethered my self-worth to their conditional approval was severed permanently. I did not hate Vivian. I did not pity her. I simply did not care. The profound, unshakable peace that washed over me in that moment was the greatest victory of my entire life. I had not just conquered my family financially or socially, I had conquered the psychological hold they had over my mind. "Chloe," I said, my voice steady, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Yes, Director. I want you to contact our telecommunications provider. Permanently block that phone number at the network level. Do the same for any associated numbers registered to Marcus Washington Jasmine Sterling or Bradley Sterling. I never want a call, an email, or a piece of physical mail from any of them to reach this building ever again." "Understood, ma'am." Furthermore, I continued, my gaze fixed on the gleaming white dome of the Capitol. "Contact our primary legal department. Instruct the lead counsel to draft a comprehensive permanent cease and desist order for all 4 of those individuals. Frame it under the strict anti-harassment protocols of our federal security clearance. If they attempt to contact me, approach my residence, or bypass my security detail ever again, they will be charged with a federal offense. Send the documents via certified courier today. Consider it done." "Director Washington," Chloe replied, her tone ringing with absolute efficiency. The connection clicked off. The blinking red light on my console vanished. It was a small, silent extinction of a lifetime of abuse. I exhaled a slow, deep breath, feeling a massive, invisible weight lift off my chest forever. The heavy, soundproofed oak doors of my office swung open. Admiral James Sterling stepped into the room. He was out of his formal dress uniform today, wearing a sharp, tailored civilian suit that still could not hide his commanding military posture. He carried a highly secured biometric tablet under his arm. "I hope I am not interrupting anything critical," Camille, the Admiral said, offering a warm, genuine smile as he crossed the expansive room. "Not at all, James," I replied, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my emerald green tailored suit. "I was just taking out the trash. What do you have for me?" The Admiral stepped up to my glass desk and placed the tablet down, unlocking it with a swift fingerprint scan. "The President just signed the executive authorization. The Department of Defense wants to expand the Iron Canopy architecture. They are requesting a full global deployment across all allied NATO intelligence networks. It is a multi-billion-dollar expansion. They want Aegis Protocol to spearhead the entire global integration." I walked around the desk and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Admiral. I looked down at the complex, shifting digital blueprints illuminating the tablet screen. It was a massive, unprecedented undertaking. It was the kind of project that would cement my legacy in the history books for the next century. "They are giving us complete operational control," the Admiral added, looking at me with profound, unwavering respect. "You built a fortress, Camille. Now they want you to build an empire. Are you ready for this level of global command?" I turned my head and looked out the massive panoramic windows. I looked at the sprawling, bustling metropolis of Washington, D.C., a city built on ruthless ambition, fragile egos, and the illusion of power. I had walked into this city as a discarded, humiliated daughter. I was now standing at its absolute pinnacle as a queen. I picked up my coffee cup, a calm, razor-sharp smile spreading across my face. "I have always been ready, James," I said. "Let us get to work." The profound lesson from Camille's journey is that your true worth is never defined by the people who blindly underestimate you. Toxic families often project their own deeply rooted insecurities using conditional love as a weapon for control and manipulation. Instead of fighting for a seat at a table that actively disrespects you, the ultimate victory is building your own empire in absolute silence. True power lies in radical independence, establishing unbreakable boundaries, and letting your undeniable success speak for itself. You do not need to seek revenge, you simply need to let natural consequences unfold while you authentically thrive. If this story inspired you to cut toxic ties and unapologetically build your own table, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your ultimate glow-up journey in the comments below.